I didn't get a lot of encouragement from my dad when it came to sports. I was a sports nut growing up. I tried to compete in everything I could possibly compete in. I had literally the little man syndrome because I was a little guy, and I just felt like I had to work twice as hard. I talked to Dad one time about lifting weights, and a characteristic to his kind of support, he said, well, not a problem. In the morning about 6 o'clock, we'll go out to the field and haul hay, and you can lift some weights. He didn't care much, but I loved competing, and I loved sports. When we first moved here late last year, moving all our stuff, there was more than one box that tumped over and just went everywhere that had to be gathered up and stored to go through later. But I have a little box that sits on my dresser, and it's got memories of my life from way back. Why I keep some of those things, I don't know, but it kind of spilled on me. And as it spilled, I found there are all kinds of athletic awards in it. And I was very proud of that when I was a kid because I was short. I was not real fast, and so when I could compete and win a ribbon, but what I noticed, and I have noticed this before, they were all silver medals and red ribbons. As you well know, I was never first. I was always second. And nobody remembers second. They always remember first. And I remembered that back in the day, and I have thanked Kyle on many occasions. Kyle Walker was my buddy in the Briar, where I did some of my best sportsman stuff. And we played tennis, and he won and went to state 3 years in a row. I barely made area. We played football, and we won several awards. I broke my neck. We raced and had track, and that's where I got most of my second place medals, because Kyle, I was always watching Kyle run by me. But one of the things I realized is that the only reason I was as good as I was is because Kyle was always just in front of me, just enough to annoy me to make me go faster. I was a high jumper when I was 5 feet 6 inches maybe tall, and the two guys I was competing against at Uvalde were 6'4" and 6'5". Obviously, I was going to be the one that was challenged, but I still won 3rd place. But the embarrassment of it all was when they took the picture for the paper. Because you know how they set up the podium for pictures, the 3rd, the 2nd, and the 1st. Well, the two guys in 1st and 2nd were 6'4" and 6'5", and I was 5'6". And in the paper, they could get the knees and my head, and then the other guys. And I got ridiculed about that mercilessly. But I've always been a fan of the little guy. The guy that doesn't get the raves and the reviews, doesn't get the paper. That's me and Jace, that's right. There you go. Jace on with me. I've always been in favor of the little guy. And this is one guy, I just thought, you know, I'm going to do an entire lesson on this guy because we don't know much about him, okay? I'll tell you right now. And I'm not going to speculate heavily. But what I am going to do is look at the text and notice something about this guy, because the text really, I mean, you're looking at Acts and Paul's missionary journeys, and it's Paul, 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 and sometimes Barnabas, but Paul, Paul. And that's what you hear, and that's what you see. And then all of a sudden here we got in the 5th verse of this text where Paul, as his custom was in verse 2, he reasoned with them from the scriptures. Oh, you know, mighty Paul. And I'm not trying to cut Paul down. Paul he was a hoss when it comes to the gospel. He was the man. But all of a sudden, it says in verse 5, the Jews who were not persuaded became envious. They got a bunch of evil men gathered up from the marketplace. They went into a mob into the city and turned the city into an uproar. And out of the blue, they attacked the house of Jason. Why? Who knew Jason? He was like that 2nd place to Paul. Jason was kind of not anybody, really, in the big picture of how we have history recorded in the beginning of the church. But what is important here is that Jason was, number one, known. How did they know to go to Jason's house? I mean, Paul was the one who was going from city to city and doing all this damage to people who were caught up in false doctrine. And Paul was doing miracles just beyond belief in some places. He was teaching and preaching, converting people left and right. How did they know to go to Jason's house? Because people knew where Paul was and who Jason was. Most people don't get it. And I've been on lecture circuits, and I've been on gospel meetings and done lots of things, and you have people come up and say, oh, great sermon, they smile, and they know your name, and they expect you to know theirs. It's like, I have trouble with my own kinfolk remembering names. And these people saw me, and they knew who I am, but I got to remember 5 million people. All they got to remember is, 20 speakers. But here's the important thing. Paul couldn't have done what he did without Jason. Jason was a support mechanism, and most of the time, support mechanisms don't even get mentioned. I'm going to be preaching later on this year a couple of sermons about some prophets. God doesn't even give us his name, who he is. I'm probably glad he did. Somebody named him after him, right? Named their kid after him. But there are support mechanisms that cause the Word of God to have been spread in this time and in this era, and it would not have been possible without them. Jason was that kind of person, and he was known. People knew where to go. They knew where Paul was standing. They knew who he was with and who was supporting him and giving him aid so that Paul could do what he could do. I've mentioned this a couple of times, and I know it embarrasses her, but I'm going to mention it anyway. I don't know how Paul did it, because I'm more in the league with Peter. I have a wife that supports me. What do you call it? Battle buddy? Is that what? Battle buddy. That's what, yeah. Wes calls his wife battle buddy. That's somebody that stands with you in the spiritual fight. I couldn't function properly without it. I found that out when she went to Ohio to visit her uncle and left me for a whole week. And I just almost dried up, blew away, and famished, but I depend on her. She is the reason I get to do what I do. People don't realize how important your role is when you are support. You don't have to be in the lead. You don't have to be in the pulpit. You don't have to be the one everybody looks to. You can be there, and you can be the reason why whoever is up there doing what he's doing is able to do it. It is an important role. I am so thankful God gave us this guy's name. And he told us who it was. But here's the other side of that picture, because support, sometimes when you support the right way of things, the right way to go, you catch flack. I visited with people around the community here. It hasn't been long ago that this was a dry county, if I understand correctly. And I know some folks who did not want it to become wet. And when it did become wet, they caught a lot of flack because they did not support the winning side. And that is the case sometimes for Christians, especially those of us who are caught up in support. We're not necessarily the quarterback. You got to have one, and he better be good, or the team's going to suffer. But if you don't have that pulling guard, I'm sorry, there ain't going to be a run made. That quarterback isn't going to get protection. You got to have that guy there. If he's not there, it doesn't work. And so one of the things that Jason reminds me of is the fact that when you help, you're going to go through the same things a star on the team may go through, but you're not going to get all the headlines, but you're just as valuable and just as important. They came to Jason's house because they knew where he was staying. But you'll notice in the next verse, it says, but when they did not find him, evidently, I don't know where Paul was at the time. If he was smart, he was hiding last time they stoned him. So anyway, they didn't find him. But here's the way that the treatment that Jason received. They dragged him and some of the brethren to the rulers of the city. Now, we have seen this go wrong for individuals when they get dragged up in front of somebody, and then they get dragged out and they get stoned. So the support he was giving, without the headlines, still could have very well cost him his life. And that's another part of this that a lot of folk don't see, is that support mechanism may not be in the highlight reel. It may not be on the front page news, but they still suffer sometimes the same kind of retribution, persecution, and hardship that the guy in the front does when the team doesn't win. And I'm telling you what, Jason was dragged out just like a common criminal. And notice the indictment against him, which I think you couldn't say anything better about somebody who is supporting a guy like Paul to preach the gospel. I like the way the old King James reads it. I've got the new here. It says, These who have turned the world upside down have come here too. The gospel was known. And it was known in part, and I don't want to take anything away from Paul, because when Paul went to a town, as his custom was, he went in, started from the scriptures, and started teaching. But he had to stay somewhere. He had to have support. He had to have a team on his side to help him get done what he needed to be done. That team suffered here. But I can't think of a better epitaph to give somebody than they turned the world upside down with their message. They got through to people about what was right, what was good, and what you could do to change your life. And their accusation was absolutely correct. Jason has harbored them. He's kept them. And these are all acting contrary. Whoops, this is where it gets false. Because that's what happens even to the sport folk. You get blamed for things that really have nothing to do with you at all. And that's what he did. He got blamed for saying there's another king, this King Jesus. Well, that's a misunderstanding about what the kingship is about. And so that was something they used just as an excuse to be a problem. They troubled the crowd, the rulers of the city, they stirred things up, and we all know how brilliant mob mentality is. We've seen it in our own time. You know, some of us knotheads up here in BLM, Black Lives Matter, tearing up towns, and everybody, well, not everybody, but a good portion of our media supporting them for tearing things up and destroying people's lives and destroying some people sometimes. Mob mentality just doesn't get it. And here's Jason, the recipient of this kind of mentality. I can't even imagine what he must have been feeling when he was dragged from his house, thrown in front of judges in the city, knowing full well that we've got a mob out here, and we know how mob mentality is. I mean, you just almost see the rope going over the tree and Clint Eastwood out there getting hung, right? It's just about to happen. Jason had great courage to stay with it. And when you say, well, great courage, well, it cost him. Because when they finally decided to let him go, they did let him go, but it wasn't without a cost. It says in New King James, so when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, he took money from him. It cost him to support the truth. I'm wondering sometime if it ever got to that point in this country, God forbid, I hope it never does, but if it ever comes to that point in this country where they're going to charge you if you're going to come to church, how many people would go? Well, we got enough people whining and crying because you got to give, and people don't want to hear any sermons on how you need to give and be sacrificial and be happy about it and all that. I mean, what if they just charged you to go to church? What if it cost you? And not only that, you're on an official roll now because security's been taken from you. And so everybody knows, yeah, that's where they are. They have identified, they've drawn a line, chose a side, that's where they are. Would we be willing to stand up and say, yes, that is where I am, and if it costs me, fine. I'm going to worship my God. I'm on his side. I wonder sometimes how courageous anyone would be. I've always admired Jason because much later on, and there's, I would say 99.9% consensus, that when the scholars, when you look at Romans 16, and you look at people to whom Paul references in the Roman letter, and by the way, just to be mentioned by Paul by name is quite the commendation because of the work Paul did. And here we have guys like Luke, and we have guys who are like Timothy, fellow workers. Don't know a lot about Sosipater, but we sure do know who Jason is, and we know what he went through because he stood for the truth. The point of my lesson is, I love underdogs, and Jason was kind of one of those underdogs, didn't get a lot of press. I'm so grateful that God allowed us to know who he is, because there are so many in this church like that. I haven't had an opportunity, and I know a lot of people feel the same way as I do, and I've heard them say that. But we've had several events transpire here recently. We've got a bunch that comes down our third Sunday luncheon that the numbers are up, if I understand it correctly, and we're doing real good. We have ladies and men too that cook and prepare and make this a great event. We had a summer youth series where it was pretty warm and uncomfortable in the auditorium, and yet it went over great, and I agree with Jimmy. I think it had better singing than we've had so far. But the whole point is that doesn't happen unless we have support mechanisms. Do not underestimate, my brothers and sisters, what you do when you support things this church does. Your presence, your help, the work you do to make things go off and make them go off well is a reflection on this church, and you may never get the headlines. And for that, I apologize, as well as I'm sure the elders, because they would like to thank every one of you personally every chance they get. Because in this community, people know who the church is. And it's a good thing, because we've drawn a line, and here's where we are. And we're going to stand with God, and we're going to support the things that support and glorify God's name. That's what we do. But don't think for an instant, because what you have done was not noticed or commented on, or somebody didn't come pat you on the back, because we all need that sometimes. Don't think for a minute it was not noticed. Evidently, in God's inspired word, Jason was important enough to be noted. And I appreciate God for allowing us to know this guy named Jason, because we've got lots of Jasons here now. We sure know. If you're not a member of the body of Christ, you need to be one. This is the body of Christ to be a part of if you live in this area. If you are and not living right, or if you feel like maybe you just have been overlooked sometime, go up and talk to somebody about it. Visit with them. Encourage each other. Lift each other up. We're here to edify and encourage. Lift each other up, edify each other. We're all going to heaven together. We're all going to be doing work. We're all going to be working together. And yeah, some will get noticed more than others. But frankly, we're all vital to the work. If you want to respond in any way, stand as we sing.